1977. A ship leaves the harbor of Chioggia, Italy, and makes its way to Hong Kong. It was a routine journey, however, it held valuable cargo, an advanced uranium ore processing machine worth over 200 million shillings. Initially, everything went perfect, and the weather was on the captain's side. However, in the middle of the Indian Ocean, something happened, and the MV Lucona, along with its valuable cargo, was lost to the sea. This is the story of the MV Lucona, a scandal filled with fraud and political corruption, and how the masterminds behind it even accepted murder to fill their pockets. Welcome to the Corvus Chronicles, and today we're taking a closer look at the Lucona Affair. Okay, so to understand what actually happened, we first must go back and look at the man behind the incident, Udo Proksch. Like all good villains, he was born in Germany in 1934, and his father, Udo Proksch Sr., was a vivid supporter of the Nazis. He even worked as a secretary to SS Gruppenführer Otto Wächter, as well as for the Nazi intelligence service. In 1944, he then sent his son to an elite Nazi boarding school, and Udo later recalls being the smallest and weakest boy there. But it taught him an important lesson. I had to become strong to fight back. After the war, Udo was failing spectacularly at normal life. But what Udo was lacking in craftsmanship and strength, he made up with charm and ambition. He enrolled as an art student in Vienna, where he began collecting friends, powerful friends, artists, politicians, businessmen. Slowly but surely, he grew his network. Then came 1957, a big year for Udo and a turning point in his life. A friend of his took him to Moscow for the World Youth Festival as part of the Austrian delegation, and young Udo loved Russia. In fact, he enjoyed it so much that he decided to stay there just a little bit longer. Officially, to study at the Russian Film Academy. However, some sources believe he was actually recruited by the Soviet intelligence service, the KGB. Fact is, when he came back, he spoke fluent Russian and had connections to the highest level of Soviet power. This, however, was only the start for young Udo. In 1972, the famous Damer Café in Vienna was looking for a new owner, and Udo, thanks to his powerful friends, was able to convince the owner to sell it to him. Now, of course, he didn't pay for this himself. Instead, he got the banks to loan him 100% of the purchasing price, worth over 30 million shillings, with no down payment. This was, of course, only possible due to his immense connections, especially to the Christian Conservative Party, which had a huge influence on the partially state-owned banks, which granted him those loans. After acquiring the Café Demer, Proksch used it to establish something even more important, the so-called Club 45, a secret society of politicians and elites to seize, consolidate and maintain power. Members included people like the Foreign, Defense or Finance Minister of Austria, as well as a future Chancellor and President. Even though he used his connections to the Conservative Party, he limited access to the Club 45 to members of the Socialist Party, creating, how one journalist describes it, a mafia-like tool for the governing Socialist Party, acting in a system of corruption and nepotism. This was Udo's peak of influence on the Austrian government. He was the gatekeeper to Club 45, and if you wanted access to Austria's socialist elites, you had to go through him. The club became his biggest weapon and his strongest shield, and it made him feel invincible, because when you control the interior minister, the foreign minister, and even have the ear of the chancellor, you can get away with almost everything, even murder. The plan itself was as simple as it was bold. Together with his partner Hans-Peter Daimler, Udo bought an old coal mining facility in Lower Austria. It was essentially a pile of old machines that had been rotting in the open air for years. In a rented factory hall, Udo then hired Italian laborers off the books to sandblast the rust of the old coal equipment and spray paint them new, and afterwards he listed them as high-tech nuclear equipment, worth over 200 million shillings. However, to make this lie convincing, they needed complexity. First, they founded a Swiss shell company called Zapata AG to create a convincing paper trail. Then they created a fake buyer in Hong Kong, the North Pacific Trading Ltd. Udo even convinced some of his friends in the government to provide military transportation trucks to move the secret cargo from Austria to the Italian port. Before the actual execution of the plan, there was still one crucial part missing: insuring the cargo. Udo contacted the Bundeländer Versicherungen, a partly state-owned insurance company, which happily took his contract worth 2 million shilling. So in January of 1977, it was finally time. The cargo was being loaded on the MV Lucona in the port town of Chioggia, near Venice. Udo Proksch and his partner Hans-Peter Daimler were there personally, micromanaging the loading and making sure that everything went according to plan. Captain Jakob Puster later recalled that the loading process was filled with unusual activity. Udo and his partners seemed especially obsessed with the placement of two large yellow cylindrical tanks. Udo insisted that they were placed at a specific spot in the cargo hold, right against the hull. We are now almost back to the beginning of the story, and the MV Lucona slowly made its way towards Hong Kong. On the 23rd of January, the ship was just northwest of the Maldives when Proksch's plan finally came to fruition. Shortly after 4 p.m, 2 fireballs shot out of the cargo hold, obliterating the ship within just 2 minutes, and the MV Lucona was dragged to the bottom of the ocean. Out of the 12 crew members on board, only 6 miraculously survived by clinging to a tiny lifeboat and debris. They drifted through the ocean for hours, unsure whether they would survive or not, until finally a Turkish oil tanker spotted their flares and fished them out of the water. On the morning of the 24th, before the news of the catastrophe had even reached Europe, Udo Proksch was already in Zurich, together with his co-conspirators, celebrating in a luxury hotel. After all, they thought nothing would stand in the way of their prize money. However, the insurance company had different plans. Udo Proksch initially thought the hardest part of his plan was over. After all, tons of equipment were loaded onto the Lucona, and it did leave the harbor of Chioggia, and all of it did sink to the bottom of the Indian Ocean. So it would only make sense that the insurance company had no choice but to fulfill their part of the contract, even if they did not like it. He did, however, make one big mistake, which was that his complicated fake paper trail was actually quite sloppy once you took a closer look at them. The machinery listed on the invoices was not only not used in uranium processing, but the prices were also way higher than the market average. For example, Udo Proksch sold 3 vibratory screens for 874,000 Swiss francs, almost 220,000 per piece, when their actual market value was closer to 40,000 apiece. Additionally, Udo refused to show the insurance company the invoice of the producer of the high-tech equipment for months, which makes sense since he did not have an actual invoice. This led to a long, drawn-out legal battle between Udo, his partners, and the insurance company. At the same time, it became a battlefield for public opinion, since a lot of the people saw it as an indirect fight between the two biggest parties in Austria. After all, the Bundesländerversicherung was heavily influenced by the Christian conservatives, whereas the lawyers used by Udo Proksch were high-profile social democrats. Udo, however, was not worried about a legal battle. After all, he had the backing of his Club 45, and he would make good use of his network. After having his legal claim rejected 3 times by the courts of Vienna, he turned to a friend and a member of Club 45, the president of the appeals chamber of the Vienna Supreme Court, who tried to overrule the court's legal decision to reject Udo's claim. The appeals chamber therefore ruled that Udo's company, Zapata AG, had every right to the insurance money. This court ruling caused panic within the insurance company, and they turned to a well-known private detective, Dietmar Guggenbichler, to help them out of the trouble. Guggenbichler quickly realized the true scope of the fraud, and after a quick investigation turned his findings over to the Salzburg Police Department in July 1983. Everyone involved, however, underestimated Udo Proksch's network and political power. After all, the Austrian Minister of Interior, Karl Blecher, was a member of Club 45 and one of Udo's closest friends. Karl Blecher immediately ordered the police as well as all the courts to drop any kind of murder investigation or lawsuit regarding Udo Proksch. Thankfully, not everyone gave in to the pressure from above and continued their investigation, even though they tried to stop it time and time again. Udo Proksch's political shield, however, seemed unbreakable. An appeal by the insurance company with the Vienna Supreme Court was again rejected in 1985. The leading public prosecutor of the Lucona criminal investigation was switched out, and not just the Minister of Interior, also the Minister of Justice ordered the investigation to be stopped. And then even the private investigator Guggenbichler was arrested, and he got his firearm license revoked. However, even after all this, there was one judge, Wilhelm Tandinger, who did not give up. And after failing multiple times to call in Udo Proksch for his statement, Tandinger was the first person, 8 years after the initial crime, to issue an arrest warrant to keep Udo Proksch in custody. And on the 15th of February 1985, Udo Proksch was finally arrested in front of the Café Demel. Shortly after the arrest, the Austrian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Leopold Gratz, made a statement that he himself has actually seen the uranium processing plant during the loading process in Italy, and at the same time, additional documents from the Romanian producers of the machinery were delivered to the courts directly through the ministry. Due to the additional public and political pressure, as well as those additional documents, the prosecutors had no choice but to release Udo Proksch and his partner again. After all of this, Udo Proksch seemed invincible. Even though the courts figured out that the Romanian documents were fake, without an actual witness, they could not properly file a lawsuit against Udo, and this meant, as long as everybody involved in the affair stayed silent, nobody would be charged. And even though the prosecutors tried to have Udo arrested again in 1986, he walked out as a free man just 4 days later. And with that, Udo Proksch had won. Through the power of his political network, the investigation for murder against him could not advance, and at some point the insurance company would have no choice but to pay him the insurance money. In December of 1987, however, something extraordinary happened. A journalist called Hans Pretterebner released a book about the Lucona Affair, which instantly became a bestseller in Austria and led to a change in public opinion about the case. Shortly after, in February of 1988, the captain of the MV Lucona, Jacob Puister, submits a murder lawsuit against Udo Proksch and Hans-Peter Daimler in Zurich, and a little bit later in Vienna as well. With the public sentiment turning and the additional lawsuits by the captain, it was only a matter of time until even the most corrupt official had to give up blocking the wheels of justice. And so there was only one thing Udo could do. He had to flee the country. On the 9th of February 1988, Udo visited his son in London, and from there he booked a flight to Tokyo over Washington and San Francisco. However, he never arrived in Japan. Instead, he left the airplane in DC and flew to Hawaii and then afterwards to the capital of the Philippines, Manila. There, he even underwent facial reconstructive surgery to make sure nobody would recognize him. In 1989, a political committee was called in to investigate the possible corruption around Udo Proksch, Club 45, as well as the Lucona Affair, and resulted in multiple politicians, like the Minister of Interior, stepping down. Meanwhile, Udo had one last ace up his sleeve. From Manila, together with his colleagues in Vienna, he created a fake study on where the MV Lucona supposedly sank. After all, if they cannot find the wreck, he simply has to claim that the captain and the crew sold the cargo themselves, hit the Lucona, and tried to blame him. He then made his way back to Vienna to face those charges with his new fake story about what had actually happened. He bought his tickets, flew towards Vienna, and was promptly arrested at the Vienna airport in October of 1989. The process starts just a month later, and the courts incorporated the help of an American company, Oceaneering International, to find the wreck at the bottom of the Indian Ocean. In the beginning, everything seems to go according to Udo's plan. The search crew started looking at the wrong spots and, of course, would not find anything. However, on the last day of the search, the leader of the expedition decided to ignore the provided search location and instead to trust the statements of the survivor. By moving the search to a new location, they immediately found the MV Lucona, 4,197 meters below the surface, surrounded by pieces of an old coal mining machine, and with a hole in the ship which could only come from an internal explosion. This was undeniable proof, and not even Udo's network could protect him now. In March of 1991, Udo Proksch gets sentenced to life in prison for 6 counts of murder and 6 counts of attempted murder, and his partner, Hans-Peter Daimler, gets sentenced in 1997 to 14 years. Udo Proksch later died in 2001 in prison at the age of 67. The scandal surrounding the MV Lucona should be a reminder to all of us how important it is to have an independent judicial system, transparency, and freedom of press so journalists can properly do their work. This was the Lucona Affair. Thank you all for watching. If you like this kind of deep dive into political scandals, corruption affairs, and economic fraud, leave a like, comment, or click subscribe for more exciting videos.